Welcome back to Sunrise Daily. Wow, so much happened over the weekend, and we expect a lot this week as well. INEC is in the burner for a lot. Even this week, there's remember, the mock scenario that will happen today. We'll get to that, but Osun Tribunal judgment last weekend was a lot that jarred quite a number of people. I mean, other than the APC, because they'll be pretty happy with that one. And then the question of, will students be able to travel and go vote? So does all of these things affect what? Is it tantamount? Is there any iota of election manipulation? So all of this are part of what we will be talking about this morning. So I've got two gentlemen who join us here in the studios. Samson Itodo, Executive Director, YIAGA, as well as Oluwole Osase, who's the former Director of Voter Education and Publicity for INEC. Gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for coming on today. Good to see you.
Good morning. Thank you for having us.
Well, it just got a lot of people thinking, what if we start from Osun, for instance? And when that judgment came through, lots of people kept on calling and asking, and of course, they were all awash, wondering, so what does this then mean? Wait a minute. For voting with this new system that we're talking about, how did that ever happen? Did we spend all of this money to get to where we are? Was it human error? How did they, for any fail-safe measure? There were so many questions. And it's understandable because, they expected so much from INEC. Lots of people went to register this period thinking, oh, this time it will be foolproof. And then you get to hear overvoting, they will definitely raise questions. And something that time, the system, the reportage, the results, as they trickled in, you were largely involved in that one. What were your impressions when you heard this judgment, for instance?
Well, so first, let me express my limitation. I'm limited by virtue of my work at YIAGA Africa and by virtue of our involvement in that election. But three things just come to the fore. This particular case has sort of established and imposed confidence in the BVAs as a tool used by INEC to ensure that the transparency of the voting process is guaranteed. And I think contrary to opinions out there that the judgment attacks the BVAs and it impugns on the credibility of the BVAs, I think my personal position, it's to the contrary, that what the judgment has actually done, because we're having this conversation about overvoting because there was a device called the BVAs that was able to detect that. So I think to that extent, what we're learning from this particular scenario or this case is that the BVAs is a device that indeed can detect overvoting. I think the second point, and I'm resisting the temptation to make any comments on the judgment, and perhaps let me just leave it at that, because again, this case is still ongoing. Yeah. And so I think it's just ethical to restrain myself from commenting further on this.
Understandably. But Mr. Uzi, I don't know what you expect to be. You're the long guy, right? So people will expect that you understand how some of these things may have happened and what may be going through people's minds, because they need a lot of clarity and understanding so they don't misconstrue things and go about saying, oh no, this is the cause or why this happened. Yes, we know it's still in court and it will go upstairs, as they say. But when Samson says that, yes, the BVAS was able to detect this, it wasn't done by the regular voter. There were officials who were supposed to make sure that these things don't happen. How come?
Good question, very good question. First of all, let me just quickly add to what Samson said, or reiterate what Samson said, that look, this judgment is a validation of the role BVAS has played in the process. Rather than being very negative about the whole thing, I think it exposed the overvoting. It was BVAS that exposed that, as it were. And the fact that the BVAS report was relied on, but we have to be careful. Which of the BVAS reports was relied on? Was it what was transmitted to the server, to the back end, or was it the BVAS itself? I think we have to explain and break this down to people. The majority of the tribunal, the chairman and the second member, relied on the initial report, and it's an initial report certified by INEC, admittedly. It's initial report of the back end. It was downloaded from the server, transmitted. But a couple of days later, INEC used the word synchronize. I'm not too sure I like that word, but you synchronize and say, look, have all the results been transmitted, have all data been transmitted from the machine, the BVAS itself, to the server. The machine is a physical one, and then it transmits it to a server. It now went, checked and said, there's a problem here. The BVAS report now downloaded itself, now brought it out, we now examined each BVAS machine, and now found out, no, some data was not transmitted to the server. And it wasn't a unanimous judgment. The second member, the Honorable Justice, who dissented from his two colleagues, said, look, I would rather use the primary source of this information. And the primary source of this data is actually the machine itself. It's basically a computer. So rather than go to the server where it transmitted data to, I would use the printout from the machine itself. The machines were tendered. So were the reports from the server. And there ought not to have been a discrepancy. But somewhere along the line, not all the data had been transmitted as at the time the APC obtained the certified copy of the server reports, initial server reports.
I mean, we know that there are several issues on that one.
Yes.
Because, yes, you say that word, you're not sure they should have used that word, because it's synchronization, because it proved to be problematic in the judgments. If you read through all of those, you see clearly.
Correct.
But when you then say that it wasn't transmitted, but that was a certified copy. Yes. So the questions, two separate certifications were sent. Correct. The PC had one, PDP had one.
Yes.
And so the judges had to say, look, what's going on here? But they then didn't use, you said the other judgment, the minority one should have said they should have used the one that came from the machine itself.
Yes.
But maybe you're just trying to fast track, but when you say it wasn't transmitted, doesn't that raise questions concerning the entire process? Because number one, if it wasn't transmitted, why wasn't it transmitted?
It wasn't transmitted early enough.
Early enough.
Before the first certification.
Okay, so now, when they then went ahead and gave those parties those results, I mean, those certifications, which highlighted two different scenarios, that itself proved to be an error.
Well, it happened. It's a factual situation. When you say it's an error, I don't know how to place it. In the sense that, as at the time, the thing was transmitted, but had not registered in the server, due to whatever reasons. And I'm also, like Samson, trying not to go too much to the merits of the case to prejudge what the Court of Appeal and maybe the Supreme Court will say. And we have to be careful in doing this, that there's one thing what actually happened, there's another thing that what was demonstrated in court. The court will rely on exactly what was demonstrated before it, not necessarily other information, other materials that were not available to the court as at the time it was writing its judgment. We are bound by the record of the court. We are bound by what happened in the tribunal itself. So basically, my understanding is that, yes, it was transmitted, but it had not been registered in the server as at the time INEC gave the first report. And when they discovered, they sent another report to the APC and to all the parties. When PDP applied, it was about 2 weeks later. They now sent it and sought one after, look, this is what happened, and explained the whole thing. But of course, they chose the one they wanted to. And yes, because that mistake had been made in the first place, any person to whose advantage it is will naturally exploit that. That will appear is what happened.
But Samson, do you think that how much of a challenge would this be for the voter and for the commission to explain to Nigerians that, look, in case, because I'm sure they might have read several responses and comments all over the place concerning what people think, because INEC cannot afford to allow the people to have the wrong impression of this, because this is what they've been working for almost for the next 3-4 years now. They have to have the right impression. So how much of a challenge do you think the commission has, and CSOs and the media, to ensure that, look, we focus on the right things and let people know that we can't throw the baby with the bathwater?
So there are 3 things that I expect that the commission will do today. First is the commission cannot say to Nigerians, this matter is sub judice, and to that extent, we cannot comment on the merits of the case. Okay. I think that this is an opportunity for INEC to actually explain to Nigerians what's the entire value chain of the results management process. It's there in the guidelines, no doubt. We do our bit with the Election 101, but INEC needs to just, even if it's an explanatory, that says this is how this process actually works, to help people and members of the public understand, and not say because the matter is still in court. We know that, yes, the matter is sub judice, but then there are still strategic communications that INEC needs to undertake in today and this week, so members of the public can understand, you know, what has happened and to impose confidence.
Sure, before you get to the second point. Now, if INEC were to do that, how do they deal with, because you know that people will twist whatever they say, they'll misconstrue that, they'll do whatever. How do they guard against, for instance, playing into the hands of politicians who will say, oh, okay, so is this explanation targeted at making one party look bad?
I think the question is not about, it's not about making a party look bad. It's about stating the facts. The institution of INEC is the major umpire that organizes elections. The processes in contention are INEC's processes, right? It is possible that there was misunderstanding of first the provisions of the law, the provisions of the guidelines, as well as INEC's processes in the course of the determination of this matter. And so this is an opportunity, you know, to explain that to Nigerians. It is subject to several interpretations, and the Commission has enormous powers vested on it by the Constitution. So you cannot refrain from performing your function on the basis of the fact that it may be misconstrued by different political actors. That's one. Secondly, when we did the election results analysis dashboard with channels, one of the recommendations and lessons learned from Ekiti and Osun was that INEC should transmit and publish the accreditation data on the BVAs on the IREV on election day. If that had been done, we will not be having this conversation. And I think that if there's one lesson to learn just at this particular stage, is the salience, the importance of transmitting and publishing accreditation data on the BVAs, on the IREV. So, when people visit the IREV for the general elections, they will see and compare. Because if you had done that, we won't be having this conversation. Because once the accreditation process is concluded using the BVAs, there's human interference. So that figure has to be copied and recorded on the result sheets. And in the course of that, there could be several issues. It could be computational inaccuracy. It could just be sabotage. There are several things that will come to play. And I think it's a big lesson. Why I'm highlighting this is, yes, the law says 60 days for appeal. We're already 20-something days to the elections. So perhaps this matter would not be concluded before the general elections, before the presidential and even the governorship elections. But there are lessons that we can draw from this. So that's the second action I expect. The third, action that I also expect from INEC, and it feeds into the first one, is this point about whether synchronization or two or different BVAS reports. Yeah. It is clear, and I wish that, when the first BVAS report was issued, a caveat would have been introduced, would have been stated.
Saying that probably this was interim report?
Exactly, or these are provisional. Because we know how these things actually work, that it's not automatically uploaded on the cloud. And it's just standard technological processes. That first, for the synchronization to happen, even though Uzi doesn't like that word, you need internet. There's several conditions. And so, I think subsequently, when you're issuing documents, because documents that emanate from INEC are legal documents, if they're incomplete, you can indicate that, yes, this is CTC, but with a caveat that this is provisional because there are certain processes that are still being undertaken. But the way it is, it creates room, for suspicion and integrity questions will be raised. So I think these are three sort of critical things that I expect the Commission will undertake.
Indeed, for CSOs like yourself and, of course, many people within the elite and also, of course, political parties, they will be interested in the details. But for everyday Nigerians, for people who just want to be able to cast their vote and know that the results of their votes count, shouldn't it be enough for them to know that it was the BVAs, it was the use or the deployment of the BVAs that was able to point out this overvoting?
Absolutely, and that's why the explainer from the Electoral Commission is important. It's the institution that organizes elections. Yes, we as civil society and media, we can do our bit, but the Electoral Commission has to speak. And when it speaks, it would inspire confidence on the part of the people. And just even the fact that, yes, and like I mentioned initially, that this entire process has reinforced the essence of the BVAs. And I don't think it delegitimizes the BVAs in any way. We're having this conversation because the BVAs, you know, actually function in the election. And so just reposing that trust and encouraging voters that when they go out in the next couple of weeks, they must ensure they are accredited with the BVAs. Because if you're not accredited with the BVAs, you cannot vote. And if you vote without accreditation, then it will detect overvoting, because it's only the records on the BVAs that will determine, you know, the conclusiveness of the election or the credibility of the election. So for Nigerian voters who are out there, when you go out to vote, even if a presiding officer says or issues you a ballot paper without accrediting you with the BVAs, you have a duty to insist that you must be accredited using the BVAs. And if that is not done, then just know that there's something sinister at play. And I think that that's something Nigerians need to insist, because we from civil society do have confidence on the BVAs, despite the challenges and the limitations. But it's indeed a game changer. And this entire process has established and reinforced that fact.
For a number of Nigerians, they were hoping that the transparency which they thought the BVAs was bringing in would reduce the incidences of people going to court to contest the elections. Were you a little surprised that the parties in this case insisted on going to the tribunal?
No, I'm not at all. I think we're quite a litigious society, especially when it comes to political issues. That's borne out. I don't know any other country that's as litigious as we are when it comes to such issues, because nobody accepts defeat in the polls, and they exploit all loopholes, they exploit all situations, and they clutch at everything they can. Sometimes it works, sometimes it does not. The BVAs wasn't the only issue in contention in this election. There were actually three grounds, one of which was issue of certificate forgery, which I think had previously been dealt with. But that's not the issue. They will always look for ways and means. There are more than 700 pre-election cases, nothing to do with BVAs now, pre-election cases arising from the party primaries, more than 700, affecting just about every party. More than 700, that says a lot. You know, and there's, almost all of them are still pending at different stages. Some are still in the Federal High Court, some are in the Court of Appeal, and the Supreme Court, more than 20, 30 of them are already in the Supreme Court or have been determined by the Supreme Court, and many more are still there. In fact, the courts, Federal High Court, Court of Appeal, and hardly do any other matter presently. They're dealing with re-election matters, political issues.
Well, we'll go to break now, but are you a student? Do you know if you'll be able to vote on that day? All right, so are there issues with election manipulation? Well, these are some of the other matters we'll talk about when we return in just a moment. Stay with us.
Thanks for staying with us. Well, Mr. Itodo, just before we segue into other issues on the lineup this morning, and at the risk of putting you on the spot concerning this election, how is it possible? How I'm trying to look for a way to ask you this question specifically. There is overvoting, there is BVAs, there isn't supposed to be overvoting. Consequently, whoever made the announcement of who won the election in Osun State wasn't supposed to come up with any figure beyond that which was revealed to them. So How could there have been overvoting when the BVAs was supposed to stave that off? How did those extra figures come to play in the first place?
Well, you said you don't want to put me on the spot, but you've just put me on the spot with your question. But I think if you take a look at the case, and I think for a comprehensive understanding of this particular case, it's important that people go back and look at the petitions as well as the respondent's reply and see the background to all of this. And just to save the public the pain of doing that, if you say how did overvoting occurs, first let's explain what overvoting is. Overvoting occurs when the total number of votes cast exceed the total number of accredited voters. The BVAs did accredit a certain number of people at those polling units, but the BVAs does not automatically transfer data to the INEC election results viewing portal. It is still retained in the machine. And so during the course of collation, or the course of after election has been concluded at the polling units, the presiding officer takes the BVAs, looks at the number of accredited voters, and then manually records it on the result sheet. Now, in that particular process, several things could have happened, and this is what the court needs to also sort of unravel. Did the presiding officers, in recording the number of accredited voters from the BVAs on the result sheet, did they record the accurate number of the voters who are on the BVAs on the result sheets? That's the first question. The second, and as Barrister Osun noted, that if you look at the findings from this particular case, that the machines were brought to the court, and they looked at the figures on the BVAS machines vis-a-vis what was recorded on the result sheets. And you can tell that from the data on the BVAS that was present, there seemed to be some consistency with that figure, as well as one of the BVAS reports, that INEC had tendered in court. And this just sort of exposes loopholes. And this is why I advise that INEC needs to explain to the public that the BVAS detects overvoting. It's just that the time for which the data for accredited voters is published is not automatic. This is why we have recommended from the election results analysis dashboard that it is important that at the end of voting on the day of elections, INEC should transmit and publish the number of accredited voters on the IREV and not just rely on the recorded data of accredited voters on the result sheet. So once it's there on the IREV, anybody on election day can go to the INEC election results viewing portal, see what the data is on the BVAS, as well as what is recorded on the result sheets. And so I'd say I'll just leave it at that point so I don't delve into some aspects of the case.
Well, I apologize for putting you on the spot. I think you've done some justice to the question intended, because people will be wondering, especially as we build up to this next election. So, well, Barrister Osaze-Ozi, one of the other questions to ask is, now this is a test case for us. We've had Ekiti, we've had Anambra, and a number of people have said, look, if INEC has grown integrity up until now, this Osun is another case in point, but then now we have what we have. But the general election of this month and next month, they are much bigger, much larger. The circumstances, the logistics are a lot heavier. How do we ensure that such a thing as this does not happen again? We know that there is a provision for INEC to review itself, if that's the language to use according to the Electoral Act, that after 7 days, the INEC can say, okay, well, what we did was right or no. We need to have a correction. So how do we ensure that such a thing as this does not happen again? In which case now we'll still have some back and forth at the courts.
Thank you. Well, due diligence, that's the only thing I can really say. The INEC has to be extremely careful about the caliber and type of people it recruits for this kind of exercise. But Samson has made allusions to it. Let us not think that something untoward definitely did happen. The tribunal did not find that there was a malpractice in the sense that results were falsified. I think it's important to clear that issue. In fact, I think one of the witnesses came and said there were only actually 6 incidents of overvoting, only 6 out of the total number of thousands of polling units that were in Osun State. And if INEC is more careful about the kind of people it recruits, but we must point out also that mistakes are a human thing. And Samson told you that in collation, they have to look at what's in the BVAs. Actually, it starts from the polling units. The presiding officer will now have to look at the total number of accredited people from the BVAs and enter that figure into the ECA, the first result sheet in the polling units. And they do the same thing at collation level at all levels. Sometimes you have to give your phone number, your bank account, and sometimes you make mistakes. It's a human thing. Mistakes might be made, but we have to be careful that those mistakes are not deliberate in some instances. With 150-something odd thousand polling units, truly there probably will be some mistakes, but we're hoping that those mistakes will be so few and not like the 755 that we said happened in Osun. But I think INEC will argue that only 6 of those things where there was overvoting. And overvoting may have been due to human error, not as if it was a deliberate attempt by the presiding officers to falsify the results. It benefits nobody because they did not say that these votes were in favor of A or in favor of B. There was no evidence that it was synchronized that said, look, let us do these things to favor party A or party B. It was an exploitation of what was wrong. And then the second issue is that if that was the case, should the results have been nullified, voided, and then you go back to hold election in those units or not? Those are issues that will be unraveled by the Court of Appeal. I'm sure that will be covered by some of the grounds of appeal that the lawyers have said they will file.
Well, Chamberlain just did say earlier before we took a break, asking students whether or not they were sure they would be able to vote. Now, it's a concern also for a member of the House of Representatives, Ibrahim Tukura, who said the students are busy with academic activities and INEC is engaged in distributing PVCs at the wards across the 774 local government areas of the Federation, which deprives students of the opportunity to collect their PVCs. Do you see this as a significant conundrum?
Well, it's something that is worrisome and something I think, an impasse that I think can be worked out. But first of all, the presumption is that the majority of students did not register where they are presently. I don't know whether that is correct or not, but certainly I'm sure some people registered while they were home or while they were not on campus. But a lot more also registered on campus. I recall that a couple of years ago, the EU, YIAGA, and its partners went around campuses and got people to register on campus. So during that drive, a lot of people actually did register on campus. So the presumption that all the students did not register on campus might not be a correct one. But between INEC, the NUC, stakeholders, I'm sure something can be worked out. Good thing that the period for collection of PVCs has been extended. So I think that something definitely can be worked out. But I don't see it as a major fundamental issue. An inconvenience for some people, definitely, but an amicable resolution can be worked out, I believe.
So, Samson, would it be out of place, for instance, if people were to interpret that amicable solution to be, give them a public holiday, let them go ahead and vote and travel if you want to, go and vote?
Well, I don't agree with Uzi when he says he doesn't see that as a fundamental issue. Okay. I think it's a fundamental issue. Now, when people go to vote, they are enforcing certain fundamental rights. The right of expression, because as you vote, you are expressing a particular choice. So it's a constitutionally guaranteed right. The second is the freedom of association, because you're, to an extent, also associating yourself, particularly for people who are members of political parties. And I think that the state needs to consider this important to safeguard these rights and not place impediments on the way of the students who are so enthusiastic and they want to cast their vote. Secondly, what INEC official data says is close to 40% of those who are on the register are students. And so, whilst I agree here, there are students who registered on campus, but there are also other students who registered while schools were on strike. And so I think what needs to be done here is to looking at the time limits and the complexity of managing this entire situation, what can be done. The first, you've had schools who have scheduled examinations in the week of the elections. I think that action, or those schools, need to reverse that, because when you schedule exams during elections, what you're simply telling students is forget about voting, because you have to write your exams, because you know the consequence of not writing your exams. It means you're going to resit that particular course, or to a large extent, some might even fail. So I think that those schools who have scheduled exams that week will need to reschedule the exams so that students can participate and go cast their vote. The second is for students who registered at home and are unable to collect their PVCs. I think that with this extension, if it is possible, to encourage those students to travel to collect their PVCs, but there's no guarantee that when they go back home, they're going to get their PVCs, because there are cases of unprinted PVCs. And I doubt even with this extension, we will still have uncollected PVCs. So I think just even creating that room and that opportunity and recognizing the need for these students to cast their vote, I think it's something that we can all do. The third, and perhaps, the last point around this is, yes, the NUC, INEC, and not just the NUC, but you have other commissions, regulatory institutions of polytechnics, because these institutions, INEC also draws its pool of ad hoc officials from these institutions. And so you can have school sessions running that particular week of the elections. And so even if schools don't shut down, but then you can have that period free. So for students who want to travel, to go home to cast their vote, for students who are going to be engaged as ad hoc officials, we don't, as a country, deprive them, first, of their voting rights, two, and then also, stifle their educational aspirations. Because when you don't create room for them to participate, the major priority of every student now is their school. They need to get through with school. And so let's structure this in a way that it is convenient for the students to exercise their franchise. In any case, because they are also Nigerians and they constitute the largest bulk of our population.
Yeah, that's 40.8% of those who registered actually on this matter.
Okay.
On the election manipulation matter?
Indeed, that's what I was about to just swing to, because just on Friday, your CSO, in conjunction with a number of other civil society organizations, came up with the election manipulation risk index. What was that about, and what exactly were you trying to highlight?
So first, the election manipulation risk index looks at 6 variables. It's a scanning tool. And for us at civil society, we want to draw the attention of stakeholders to the insidious nature of election manipulation. A lot of people think elections are only manipulated on election day. And no, elections can be manipulated before election day, because election is not an event, it's a process. And when you undermine and compromise processes leading up to the elections, it raises question about the legitimacy of electoral outcomes. And so what we did was to look at 6 variables. What are these variables? One is INEC capture, and each variable has its own indicator. So INEC capture, has about 5 indicators. You look at the appointment of recs with partisan backgrounds. You look at the attacks on INEC offices. You also look at, this mobilization of party supporters as ad hoc officials, and then issues relating to untimely release of INEC funding, because those are ways you can stifle the Electoral Commission, and this level of political interference with the Electoral Commission can impugn on the credibility of elections. We looked at the second variable around resistance to BVAs. The third one is also voter suppression that is also widespread across 32 states. We also look at history of election manipulation, look at states, you know, where they have history of falsification of results, overvoting. These are incidences that are already captured, you know, not just in INEC reports, but also judicial pronouncement. We also looked at things like election litigation, frivolous litigation in the build-up to the election to undermine the credibility of the process. So these are sort of the 6 variables with the indicators. And based on our sort of analysis, we categorize states into high risk, medium risk, and low risk. So any state that has more than 3 variables amongst the 6 variables is considered a high-risk state. And based on our analysis, there are 22 states with high risk of election manipulation. There are 12 states with medium risk, and then 3 states with low risk. We're going to be releasing 3 iteration reports throughout the elections. And so our expectation is that the reds that you see on the map will switch to yellow. And if it switches to yellow, then we can reach a level of comfort. But currently, it is important that citizens and stakeholders in those states keep an eye on those 22 states, including the 12 states that have medium risk, because the probability that they might switch from being medium to high risk, it's also there as we build up to the election. So it's actually fluid, and the goal is to help citizens understand election manipulation, but also look at risk mitigation measures. And I give a classic example of, for instance, some of the risk mitigation measures that we mentioned, particularly on voter suppression, because we're speaking about, you know, students. When you don't, so it is just confusing what's happening across some states. INEC on one hand says they've printed the PVCs. People show up to collect their PVCs. They are told their PVCs are not ready. And I've seen cases where, you know, voters have gone to collect their PVCs. At the first instance, they told them the PVCs are not ready. But they insist. And from nowhere, the PVC shows up.
Whoa.
And so it raises question. And the statement INEC also issued, and it's repeatedly mentioned this in a statement, that is investigating these cases of deliberate attempt to restrain or some of its officials either extorting people, but also not issuing those PVCs.
That's
and I hope that
too.
it is manipulation, because when you suppress votes, you know, what you do is you want to dilute, you know, the impact or the voting strength of a particular set of people, and you prevent them from voting. It's the same thing about the PVC buyout. Because across states, politicians are buying PVCs off people. Why are they buying PVCs off people? Because they don't want those people to cast their vote. So you are suppressing their votes. And that is the variable that is prevalent across 32 states compared to other variables in our analysis in the Election Risk Manipulation Risk Index.
Well, I'll ask you a further question, but let me ask Mr. Uzi, you know, as somebody who's worked with INEC, when you saw that report released, maybe you just had a cursory look at it, how did that come across to you?
The reports by YIAGA?
Yes.
Well, it's a good job, a wonderful job. I happened to be there when, and I was fortunate to have a preview of the report before it was even actually officially launched. It's something that all stakeholders have to take a closer look at, especially the security agencies and the Electoral Commission. Some of the issues highlighted are very common, very well known to us, to everybody. But there should be a deliberate attempt to reduce the risk level such that each and every state should be low risk. You cannot completely eliminate them. You cannot completely, there's suggestions in the reports and recommendations which will go a long way. But let me take electoral litigation. It's not litigation itself that's the problem, but it's the quantity, the numbers of litigation. You overwhelm the courts. Some judges have fallen ill because they still have to write longhand. They still have to record everything. They still have to give judgments. And a particular judge had about 53 cases to handle. You know, task forces were set up, but and all cases are in the Federal High Court.
But Mr. Ozi, pardon me to jump in, but people also say, look, does INEC actually see that as election, as manipulation? Because some of them claim that INEC themselves caused these things. So
No,
that's why politicians have to go to court.
these are pre-election matters, that intra-party arising from party primaries. The 700 I mentioned that has nothing to do with INEC, but INEC is a defendant in all of them.
Some say that INEC themselves, because when they say, well, we monitored this, no, we didn't monitor this, and those kind of things, they say, well, they are part of the problems.
In most of them, I happen to be involved in quite a number of them. In most of them, INEC had no role to play. Some INEC brought reports, some INEC did not go, some were postponed. There's a particular case that we're handling where a presidential candidate say should declare him as not qualified or as disqualified because he took honorary citizenship of a city, for example. You have all sorts of cases. You'll be amazed at some of the cases being filed in court. And you know, some may get judgments.
I think the one that worries me, the indice that really worries me the most is number one, INEC capture.
Yes.
That is serious.
It is.
I mean, this is coming at a time, because I'm also looking at the timeliness of this report. I know that what you're trying to do is, put stakeholders on notice, and you want the people to be educated. But this is also at the time when people should have confidence. Because INEC right now, is telling people we're ready to conduct these elections. They will go on as planned. Yes, there are a number of challenges what they're looking at, but they're saying we're on top of the game and, it's going to go on regardless. But we have a number of headwinds. We've seen that of the Osun elections now, raising questions about whether or not the BVAs has really made a difference to our elections, even though INEC maintains, and even you have also reiterated, that the BVAs has helped a great deal. But when you begin to see indices that talk about INEC capture, and it's something that we know, as you said, is a process, how do we begin to vet, for instance, the people within INEC a few days to the elections? How does that affect the confidence of the people in looking at the institution meant to conduct free, fair, and credible elections? Let me ask you first.
Okay, it's a delicate situation, and if we look at the indices of those INEC capture, there are so many variables. Part of the thing, for example, is appointment of INEC commissioners and on officials. That has nothing to do with the commission itself, but has everything to do with the appointing authority. And civil society, the media, a lot of people made a lot of noise, even when some of these people went for screening before the Senate. In the Senate's wisdom, they found that they found them appointable, and so they were appointed, although we've had incidences where certain people were not found appointable and were dropped, which is fair enough. But there are so many different things. We cannot but help to try to build confidence. There's a short-term solutions, there are long-term recommendations being made. Long-term, of course, the law says, the Constitution says you don't appoint partisan people. Unfortunately, the Constitution does not say if I was a partisan today, I could be non-partisan tomorrow, whatever else. It doesn't make reference to a length of time after which you may have held public office or you may have been a party member. It doesn't. So there's some challenges with that. In everything we do, we almost have an eye on electoral reform. Yeah. And so those are things. But in the terms of the short term, those INEC can appoint, for example, returning officers, collation officers, and officials for the election, it must ensure that they are, as much as it practically can, that those people are not partisan. They are not, they've not publicly demonstrated favoritism towards any candidate or sympathy for any candidate or political party. If there are reports of that and they are credible and there's enough time to investigate that, then those people must be dropped. But sometimes some people are honest and straightforward, have integrity, but because you cannot compromise them, one party might just write a petition. And if you drop everybody just on baseless petitions, then you'll have nobody to conduct an election for you.
I want to ask whether you think this will have any effect on the confidence levels of the people.
Well, quite frankly, Nigerians they've been following this process. It will, and this is why you have it's risk, because the election manipulation risk index is a scanning tool that should help citizens understand this, and there are risk mitigation measures. And just to harp on the point about confidence, there are a lot of confidence building measures that INEC needs to take. We started this segment of the show about how the Commission should communicate with Nigerians. The second is there are states where we know the background of some of those resident electoral commissioners, and as part of confidence building, INEC can actually deploy people who have unimpeachable, credibility, people who have competence, people who have character, as a risk mitigation measure. Things like the HODs of ICTs, the HODs of operation, the administrative secretaries. In these states where, we have some recs that are being deployed, you can appoint, people who are incorruptible to keep those people in check. There are also issues around due diligence on the recruitment of ad hoc officials who will be managing this particular election. So there are several confidence-building mechanisms and actions that INEC needs to take. Stakeholders also need to inspire confidence. And quite frankly, with all of this that is happening, INEC has a unique opportunity. A unique opportunity has been presented to the Electoral Commission to not only set the record straight, but to also inspire confidence. And I believe that in INEC, there are people who are incorruptible. There are people who have character, who have high regard for integrity. And those people would need to be placed in strategic positions to limit any form of manipulation. But then it's also the political interference with INEC. You read in the papers where there have also been attacks on INEC servers. You can just tell that the politicians are going for a broke in this election. And if it means putting more pressure on INEC, if it means interfering with INEC, if it means compromising INEC officials, they are willing and prepared to do so. And our duty, as citizens, is to, yes, support INEC, protect INEC's independence, but also call out these actors who are interfering with the operations of the Electoral Commission.
All right, we need to go. There are several other issues that need to be called out. I mean, I heard it before, but now they're bombarding me again with some of these things. They say that when you go to collect your PVCs, that they're actually asking them to thumbprint. And you wonder, why would anybody ask anybody to thumbprint before you collect your PVCs? So that is not part of the requirements to pick up your PVC. So
no, it is. It is part of the requirement. The standard operating procedure. Yes, so you just thumbprint to indicate that you've collected. You either sign or you thumbprint. It's just that there's inconsistency because a lot of people have also asked that question. And that cannot, it's the sheet, it's a collection register. It's different from the ballot paper. Yes, it's just acknowledging that you've collected your PVC, so that tomorrow, if someone else had collected your PVC and you claim that, there was collection by proxy, INEC will have evidence to show that, hey, isn't this your thumbprint or isn't this your signature?
Okay, but so what about when people say that, look, the sheets that they give to them didn't look like an INEC sheet, they just thumbprinted and they're wondering, this looks a bit odd. Is that supposed to be the case?
No, the proper register.
No, it's a proper collection register. It's there. There's a column for it in the collection register. But in some locations, you will find there's no collection register. People have to write their names in those cases. And again, on election day, come on, guys, you'll be given a ballot paper. If there's any thumbprint on that ballot paper, reject it. It is not your thumbprint. And quite frankly, I think that in all my years of working on elections, at least for elections in Nigeria, I have not seen cases where already thumbprinted ballot paper is issued to a voter and before the voter casts a vote. In any case, if there are two thumbprints on a ballot paper, it's voided. So I think this misinformation, we need to correct it. It's actually fake news. But then anything is possible. This is Nigeria. But vigilance is important. On election day, they will issue you a ballot paper from the booklet, and that ballot paper would not have any thumbprint. If it has any thumbprint, reject it and ask for a ballot paper without any thumbprint.
So there are several issues which, of course, we'll pick up much later about the responsibilities of party agents on this election day to ensure that no untoward scenario plays out. What happens to ad hoc staffs if they are the ones who were culpable in that serial overvoting? There's several issues, really, but we can't touch on all of those. Hopefully, as we progress, we'll keep going on. This is what education matters. It's not an easy thing. Well, I want to thank both of you for coming. Samson Itodo and Olole Osaze-Uzi. Thank you.
Thank you very much.